Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a quiet space where science drifts at the same pace as thought, and stories of the Earth are allowed to unfold without hurry. Tonight, we're beginning a long journey into a question as old as imagination itself, a question that lingers like the taste of salt on air after rain. What if the world was nothing but water? What if the continents we trust beneath our feet had never risen, and the only surface we knew was ocean stretching farther than sight? Before we sink into the idea, I want to invite you into this moment with me. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you near the sea, where tides leave their whispers on the shore? Or are you far inland, where oceans feel less like a presence and more like a dream someone told you once? Try to remember the last time you stood beside water. A lake perhaps, or a river, or waves moving in steady rhythm across sand. Do you remember how silence gathered around you, how the mind reached down into that hidden world and asked, without words, what could be living there, unseen? The surface promised clarity but never delivered answers. And in that half-knowing there was wonder. Now, let us imagine that this surface, this mirror of blue, is all there has ever been. No mountains, no deserts, no forests of green. Just an unbroken expanse of ocean. Life itself would have been written differently. Evolution, so rooted in chance and environment, might never have touched stone or soil. Our own existence could have floated away before it began. Could civilizations have found footing on drifting islands of coral? Could memory itself have formed in currents, carried not by paper or clay tablets but by the patterns of tides? Science tells us Earth has come close before. In the deep geologic past, water has spread wider than our maps can show. At times when ice retreated, sea levels rose so high that continents shrank and vanished. Sediments hidden far beneath the deep prove it. Layers of rock showing forests drowned, rivers erased. Isotopes in ancient shells whisper of oceans so wide, so dominant, that Earth itself seemed restless, shifting from balance to imbalance in cycles older than all of human history. Water is not tame. It is memory itself, erasing and writing over what came before. And yet, water preserves even as it dissolves. The bones of ancient creatures lie in calm silence beneath the depths. Fossils sleep under pressure, their shapes slowly twisted into stone. Entire forests, once alive with insects and wind, rest at the bottom as black seams of coal, their voices transformed into echoes the planet keeps like secrets. Is it possible, then, that the Earth has already lived through something close to a water world? Could our current age of land and settlement be only a rare pause, a low tide in a greater cycle of flood and retreat? We do not know. That is the beauty and the ache. The ocean is both promise and absence. It is creation and loss intertwined. Look upon it, and you see endless possibility, yet you feel, even without being told, that it holds everything we have forgotten. Perhaps civilizations, perhaps entire epochs, washed away and dissolved like salt. Not because their trace was weak, but because water is stronger than remembering. Imagine drifting across such a world. Days marked not by hills or valleys, but by the sun rising over the same unbroken horizon. Imagine storms rolling without end, never striking land, each wave carrying its own history before dissolving back into the whole. Would we have learned patience, or would we have felt perpetual exile? Would we have known ourselves at all without the grounding of stone beneath our steps? Maybe the deepest question is not whether life could survive, but whether memory itself could survive. Without ruins to stumble upon, without fossils lying in cliffs, without layers of soil to uncover. What then? Could the past remain in us, carried only in stories swirled like eddies across an ocean planet? Or would time itself become water-like, fluid, erasing, endlessly circling back? As you breathe in and let that image rest, consider how fragile our world of land really is. Continents rise and fall not on human scales but on tectonic ones. Plates slip beneath the ocean, mountains are swallowed, islands vanish. We stand on shifting ground, convinced of permanence, yet the planet has already begun stories of disappearance. And one must wonder, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten, drowned, or left sleeping beneath the tides. Long before our stories, long before the first whispered myths of floods and gods of water, the earth itself bore memories of oceans far greater than the ones we know today. The flood is not only in human legend. It is written into the planet's body, layer by layer, like a diary sealed in stone. If we listen closely, geology speaks to us in the soft voice of sediment and strata. Cores pulled from the seabed reveal ancient shifts, signs that waves once reached places now deep inland. Fossils of shells lie far from any modern coastline, embedded in cliffs of chalk and limestone, telling us that seas advanced and retreated not just once, but many times. There were ages when Earth's balance tipped and the continents shrank, almost disappeared altogether. Entire regions vanished beneath the waterline, forests sinking, dunes swallowed, mountains softened into islands before they too were erased. What remains to us are only fragments, records written in isotopes, traces of oxygen locked inside ancient shells, telling us when oceans were heavier, deeper, when warmth melted more of the ice than our maps can capture. Deep time is not a steady rhythm. It is a breathing, and sometimes that breath is drawn in as sea level falls, only to exhale in long, slow floods that could last tens of thousands of years. Imagine an Earth where each tide is not measured in hours, but in millennia. The shoreline creeps forward like a patient hand, day after day, century after century, until it reclaims what once seemed eternal. Villages and forests would have felt these advances not in sudden catastrophe, but as a silence that deepened each generation, as waves crept farther into valleys until an entire way of life was gone. And even before memory was carried in words, the earth itself held its own kind of remembrance. Subduction carries the floor of old oceans down into the mantle, dragging fossils into heat and pressure where they are destroyed. What does it mean when the very act of remembering leads to erasure? Perhaps the planet forgets on purpose, recycling itself through fire and stone, reshaping so that no single version of Earth will ever last. In this forgetting, there is both entropy and renewal. Maybe memory in a planet is not about keeping, but about becoming. And still, buried in cliffs and basins are the paler voices of what flooded long ago. There are ammonites spiraling through the rock, their shapes like frozen turnings of time itself. There are forests of coral found stranded in desert stone, proof that even arid lands once shimmered beneath shallow seas. Some epochs lived only underwater, whole worlds hidden in their own silence, worlds we can only imagine now through fragments left behind. Listen long enough and you begin to ask, are our stories of mighty floods only myths, or are they echoes of something older, passed down not just by words but by landscapes themselves? Could it be that human memory is simply repeating what the earth already knows, that water always returns, that land is always eventually temporary? Perhaps the first flooded memory is not something we invented, but something we inherited from the stones beneath us. If we let this thought rest, we begin to wonder. If seas have come and gone so many times, reshaping the ground under our feet, then where does stability really live? Is it in the land we cling to, or in the water that never leaves? And with that thought, the horizon shifts again. If floods can erase continents, if seas can stretch farther than myth, then in such a boundless ocean, what fragments of land would remain? If floods can erase continents, if seas can stretch farther than myth, then in such a boundless ocean, what fragments of land would remain? Perhaps only the highest reaches of mountain chains, the sharpest spires of volcanic rock, the scattered ridges of tectonic scars. Small islands of stone, lifting their heads above water, surrounded by silence so vast it could feel like a second ocean. An ocean not of liquid, but of stillness. Imagine drifting across this expanse and coming upon one of these lonely peaks. It would stand like a fragment of memory, a reminder that not all had been erased, that beneath the waters there was still a hidden spine connecting everything. Even the tallest mountains we know today, Everest, the Andes, the Himalaya, are only temporary guardians, destined eventually to sink as tectonic plates shift and erosion shaves them to nothing. In a water world, their rise and fall would be even quieter, a brief emergence and a quicker drowning. Geology shows us that mountains are never permanent. Volcanic summits push upward from vents where molten rock breathes through Earth's crust, only to face the inevitable. Waves striking, storms grinding, salts slowly dissolving their strength. What takes place on continents in 10 million years, the sea can achieve in one. Stone, thought to be eternal, becomes sand, and sand becomes sediment, falling once again into the abyss. And so these islands, scattered like punctuation across blue eternity, would be temporary beacons of solidity in a world otherwise without anchor. They would not last, but they would matter, if only because in their shadows, creatures might hide, currents might shift, life might cling. Picture one of these volcanic islands rising, black and sharp against an unbroken horizon. It would be a summit of fire made cold, carrying deep within it oxygen from Earth's mantle, carbon from buried oceans, iron twisted under heat. To step on such a shore, if stepping were possible, would be to step directly on a pulse of geologic time, a place where inner Earth reached outward simply to remind itself that it was still alive. But the scale here is unsettling. These peaks, no matter how tall, would be commas on a page of water so wide that their presence felt more like interruption than foundation. Would they feel like salvation, or would they make us ache more deeply for the idea of land? And then there is the silence. Not silence as absence of sound, but silence as enormity. Waves moving, winds whispering, whales singing faint chords in the deep. Yet all of it colliding with the fact that around each stone refuge is nothing but water. The air itself would bend with loneliness. If you stood upon one of these islands and turned in all directions, you would witness an endlessness that denies edges, a horizon looped into itself. What then is smallness? What then is presence? Perhaps the islands would exist just to remind you not of stability, but of scale. We can ask ourselves, what organisms might weave their stories there? Birds nesting with no place to migrate. Crabs dwelling on shores that vanish with tides. Fragments of coral clinging desperately to new basalt flows before another eruption buries them again. Could it be that even memory itself, in such a fragile place, would live only in patches, carried by each species in its own body? Maybe not an archive etched in cliffs, but small, temporary legacies written in shells, feathers, bones, only to be scattered and consumed by the sea once more. And what of us? Could humans endure in such a world of fragments, building rafts that sought the next peak, clinging to stone spires that might disappear in a single earthquake or eruption? Would identity itself dissolve into migration, into waiting and drifting? To make a map of such a planet would be to chart absence more than presence, noting not where land is, but where it used to be. A map that changes every season, every generation, every tide. These islands, then, are more than stone. They are metaphors of memory. They stand because they cannot last, their silence louder than any storm. They remind us that permanence has always been an illusion. And yet, if these tiny fragments of Earth could exist, could rise briefly above an all-consuming ocean, we are left to wonder. What else rests beneath the surface unseen, waiting for its brief emergence into light? And if fragments of stone can rise briefly above the silence, we begin to wonder what rests beneath. For in the deep places where the water has always spoken louder than rock, another kind of memory waits, fossils that sleep under layers of pressure, entire histories hidden in the mineral silence below. Beneath the endless sea, beneath the heaving currents and drifting storms, lie forests that once touched the sky, animals that once walked in sunlight, their bodies transformed into stone echoes, reminders not of what is, but of what has been. Fossils are more than remains. They are the planet's handwriting, pressed into stone with patience that only deep time can afford. A fallen tree in an ancient swamp becomes carbon, becomes coal, becomes the story of photosynthesis locked away for millions of years. The skeleton of a great reptile, swallowed by mud, becomes calcite and quartz, its bones no longer bone but a mineral cast of existence. And every shell, every leaf vein, every tooth dissolved, leaves behind not emptiness but shape, a delicate impression that whispers, I was here. Under the ocean, this process unfurls endlessly. Sediment drifts in steady curtains, carrying sand and silt from vanished rivers, layering them upon the remains of life. Slowly, cell by cell, organic matter yields to minerals, and the living turns into the geologic. What was once soft gains permanence, though in a quiet paradox. The permanence is itself temporary, susceptible one day to subduction, to heat, to metamorphosis that erases even the fossil's final imprint. So Earth both remembers and forgets at once, recording and erasing as part of the same breath. Could it be that this is how memory functions on a planetary scale, not as storage but as cycles of remembering, releasing, reshaping? When we hold a fossil, even in imagination, we hold not just a creature but a moment. Oxygen levels were different, climates were warmer or colder, continents were colliding or drifting. Each fossil is a snapshot of atmosphere, of chemistry, of relationships between beings and their habitats. Oxygen isotopes within shells trace the warmth of seas long gone, letting us reconstruct not only the presence of life, but the mood of an entire ocean. To imagine fossils beneath a drowned world is to imagine libraries submerged, collections of pages never written in human hands but laid down slowly, atom by atom, waiting in the quiet dark. And yet, most of these fossils will never be seen. Entire epochs are buried and lost in sediment too deep to recover, layers sinking into trenches and pulled under tectonic plates to be melted and reborn as volcanic stone. It means whole chapters of Earth's history are gone forever, eras of animals and forests that never leave behind more than whispers in isotope trails, faint chemical edits in the rock record. What would it mean to live in a universe where so much is simply erased by design? Do we accept that forgetting is essential to the Earth, or do we keep searching, hoping for fragments it allowed to survive? Maybe that is why fossils feel so powerful to us. They are not just remnants of life, but survivors of forgetting. Each one made it through decay, pressure, subduction, extinction, entropy, carrying forward even when entire lineages didn't. Each fossil is a resistance, fragile yet stubborn, against the tide of erasure. And when we look at them, in a museum or through a photograph, what we feel is more than curiosity. It is recognition, a gentle awareness that time does not grant permanence lightly, and that even permanence is only borrowed. So beneath the oceans of a water world, beneath our imagined expanses of blue, fossils would lie in silence, as they always have. Not because they need to be remembered, but because the Earth cannot help but write its story, even where nobody is left to read it. But this thought only deepens the question. If these fossils remain hidden below water and stone, untouched and unseen, what other signs of the past might sleep there too, things not born of nature, but of us? But if fossils are fragments of memory turned to stone, what of the memories too subtle to leave behind bones and shells? What of the stories whispered not in shape but in chemistry, in the quiet shifting signatures of atoms themselves? Deep within ice, in shells, in sediments thousands of meters beneath the ocean floor, there are clues locked into isotopes. Tiny variations in oxygen so small we cannot see them, and yet they hold entire worlds of the past. These isotopes, fractions of oxygen with slightly different weights, become the quiet archivists of Earth's history. They are timekeepers hidden in the very breath of water. When the world grows colder, heavier isotopes remain in the oceans while lighter ones are caught up in ice, frozen in polar sheets that hold the memory of winters longer than imagination. When warmth returns and glaciers melt, the ratios shift again, sending lighter water back into the seas. Locked into fossil shells, into calcite forms of ancient plankton, these ratios preserve not simply whether ice covered the poles, but how the entire Earth responded, how clouds moved, how oceans expanded, how tides crept inward. They do not describe events in words but in subtle balances, rhythms so precise that we can reconstruct the breathing of the planet across millions of years. And isn't it a strange thought, that by measuring something so invisible, we can picture climates that humans never witnessed, seas that stretched across forgotten continents, atmospheres heavy with carbon from volcanoes or light with oxygen from great forests. To hold a fossil shell and analyze its isotopes is to unlock a memory written before memory as we know it ever existed. Not because the creature intended to record its world, but because every living being carries the fingerprint of its climate inside its body. In this sense, All life becomes an unwitting storyteller, each cell impressed by the atmosphere in which it lived. Isotopes remind us that history is not only about bones or ruins, it is also about ratios, about chemical trails too faint for myth yet precise enough to reconstruct oceans. They tell us that sea levels rose and fell, that ice drowned and retreated, that waves swallowed plains which later reemerged. They whisper of atmospheres warmer than ours, colder than ours, atmospheres where storms raged for centuries, or where monsoons repeated like clockwork. The planet's story is not random. It is circled into patterns we glimpse only when we trace these atomic breadcrumbs left across rocks and ice. And yet, for all their precision, isotopes also remind us of what is unfinished. They can tell us when oceans rose, but not what it felt like to stand on a shrinking shore. They can reveal when ice sheets collapsed, but not what kind of silence that collapse made. They can describe the ocean's weight, but not the dreams of the beings who swam within it. The data is both intimate and incomplete, both a memory and a forgetting. Could it be that isotopes are the closest thing we have to the planet speaking its own diary, yet we can only interpret fragments, never the full script? Maybe they offer us not answers, but hints, leading us further into wonder. What lingers is the realization that the Earth has always been in conversation with itself. Glaciers writing into isotopes, oceans editing atmospheres, volcanoes erasing pages only to rewrite them anew. Everything records even as it forgets. Everything leaves a trail, even as it disappears. Perhaps this is the true rhythm of memory. Not to hold forever, but to let go, to shift, to evolve into something else. And as we rest with this thought, with atoms holding secrets of oceans older than humanity, we begin to notice something else. If such delicate clues are hidden in water, in stone, in shells, then what of the surface above? What do the oceans themselves, stretching glass-like beneath the sky, reflect of this hidden memory? Perhaps an ocean is not only full of salt and life, but also of echoes, reflections we haven't yet learned to see. On a world where water covers everything, these reflections would become the true continents, the landscapes we carry with our eyes when solid ground has disappeared. A water world is not just surface and abyss. It is mirror, endless mirror. The horizon would no longer separate earth from sky, but dissolve into a soft, seamless union of blue. Imagine an ocean so still at dawn that the sky does not simply rest above it, but continues downward, as though two heavens hold the viewer in their center. Clouds form and pass, painting themselves not once but twice, drifting in the air while their shapes stretch across the glass-like water below. It is a dream that repeats itself with every hour, every season, never written in stone but always rewritten in light. Some nights the stars themselves would scatter across the surface, constellations doubled, each wave carrying galaxies that tremble with the faintest ripple of wind. To live here would be to live between reflections, unsure whether it is the sky turning into ocean, or the ocean that has begun to breathe as sky. Science tells us that such vast expanses of reflective sea would change the planet's balance. Albedo, the measure of reflectivity, would climb. Sunlight would rebound, cooling some regions, while the sheer spread of water would fuel immense evaporation, seeding the atmosphere with thick blankets of cloud. Storms might wander endlessly, their paths unbroken, their spirals mirrored beneath them. Each hurricane would appear twice, once above in churning sky, once below in flickering reflection, until it was impossible to tell where atmosphere ended and ocean began. Perhaps in such a world we would no longer think of weather as something that moved above us, but as something we were always inside of, woven seamlessly into water and vapor. But beyond physics, there is perception. How would our sense of place survive without landmarks, without edges? How would time feel if every sunrise looked like eternity? The mind, seeking difference, might feel itself unravel in the repetition, adrift in sameness so complete it begins to feel surreal. And yet, there could also be comfort in this, an eternal reminder that nothing is ever permanent, yet nothing ever truly leaves. Every cloud is temporary, dissolving and reforming, and so too are we. Maybe the mirror of a water world only shows us what we are already learning, that identity is fluid, reflected, shifted, refracted, but always present in some form. And think, too, of the silence between storms. A sky of reflections is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is only stillness. A calm sea under thin cirrus clouds, where the only movement is the slow drift of vapor, the only sound the hush of water folding into itself. In those moments, silence feels immense, almost heavier than the waves themselves. Silence becomes presence. Perhaps this silence would be the truest landscape of all. A reminder that even in an entire planet covered by water, what moves us most might not be the storms or the reflections, but the spaces in between. And yet, as we gaze at these reflections, we sense something stirring beneath them. If the surface can mirror the sky so perfectly, what lies beneath, hidden from sight, carrying its own world of currents and mysteries? If the ocean is a mirror, it is also a veil. And below it begins a darkness without horizon. An abyss where light dissolves, and silence is not reflected but absolute. And below the mirrored sky, beneath the veil of reflections, the ocean is never still. Though its surface shimmers with silence, the vast body of water carries a hidden breath, drawn not in lungs but in loops, in circling paths we call currents. In a world without continents, where waves face no boundaries of land, the breath of the ocean would stretch unbroken, wrapping the planet in slow, revolving gyres, its pulse stronger than any mountain chain, its memory deeper than any desert valley. Currents are more than movement. They are rivers within the sea, steady and colossal, shaping not only the water's temperature, but also the rhythm of the atmosphere above. Science calls this great system the thermohaline circulation, the global conveyor belt, where warm waters flow outward across the surface before cooling, sinking, and returning through the deep like an endless exhale. In a planet of only water, this system would not be disrupted by continents diverting paths. These loops would reign supreme, spiraling without interruption, like invisible architecture shaping the climate of an entire world. Imagine oceans carrying vast parcels of heat across hemispheres, deserts never forming because coastlines no longer exist to shape winds. Storm tracks would follow these currents, guided by their breath. Even the air we inhale would be shaped by their continual exchange of gases, the ocean absorbing and releasing carbon dioxide in cycles older than memory. To drift through such a world would be to drift upon the very arteries of the planet, traveling not by distance but by the heartbeat of circulation itself. Could it be that in such a place we would learn to measure time not in hours or days, but in loops of current, in the rhythms of water returning to where it began? And yet, currents are not only physical. They are carriers of history. Sediments stirred from ocean floors are lifted and spread by them, scattering tiny fragments of ancient fossils and minerals across the globe. Plankton bloom in their embrace, feeding layers of ecosystems that rise and fall in quiet dependence. In the drift of these gyres there is memory, not the kind that sits still in fossils or isotopes, but a living memory in motion. Life carrying forward, vanishing, and returning again, swept up in perpetual travel. Perhaps this moving memory is closer to us than we realize. For are we not also made from oceans carried across time, salts pulled from seabeds, minerals once dissolved in distant waves? Philosophers might say currents are the continents of a water world. They provide structure where stone no longer does. They create boundaries, not of land, but of flow, north spinning gyres in one direction, southern gyres in reverse, each claiming their own realm of destiny across the planet's surface. Within them, climates stabilize, ecosystems emerge, storms find their pattern. Without them, life would dissolve into chaos. With them, it finds its quiet order. Could it be that in such a planet, maps would be drawn not as lines of land but as spirals of water, currents replacing coastlines as the major outlines of the world? But the beauty of currents is also their fragility. A small change in salinity, in temperature, in ice melt, and the entire conveyor belt shifts. Sometimes it slows, sometimes it redirects, sometimes whole loops stall for centuries. Earth's own history tells us so. During past ice ages and warm intervals, isotopes traced currents pausing, redirecting, carrying climates into sudden transformation. A water world with no continents would magnify this, its breath becoming the only architecture that decides fate. Entropy, hidden beneath still waters, always waits, and through it all, silence prevails. No matter how vast the churn beneath, the surface returns each evening to its calm reflection of the sky. The great gyres turn without witness, carrying warmth, memory, and stories across the earth. Only in the drifting of weather, in the migrations of whales, in faint traces of chemical change, do we glimpse the hidden order of currents. They are the breath we never hear, the architecture we never see, the continents of motion beneath our feet. And this thought softly unsettles, because if even currents can act as continents, if motion itself replaces stone, then what waits below them, deeper still? What quiet truths are carried in the abyss where currents finally sink into darkness, falling into cold so complete that light, reflection, and even memory dissolve? And if currents are the continents of a water world, carrying heat and memory across the globe, then what lies beneath them? As each gyre sinks, drawn by cold and the pull of gravity, it descends into the quietest regions of the planet, a realm deeper than any mountain is tall. Imagine drifting downward into that abyss, where no shoreline waits, no familiar reference softens the journey, only the slow surrender to darkness that thickens with every meter. These depths stretch not as a floor, but as absence, a vertical wilderness without walls, where the world feels unending in both direction and silence. The ocean basins of Earth descend farther than Everest climbs. They form trenches so deep that light has never touched their floor, mountain chains inverted into negative space. Here, entropy reigns not as destruction but as stillness. Organic matter rains slowly downward, flakes of carbon snow from lives lived above, drifting for months before settling in soft layers across the abyssal plains. Small creatures rise and fall with this faint sustenance, some luminous, some blind, each bearing forms shaped by pressure instead of sunlight. To us it may feel alien, but to Earth it is natural, a place as essential as any forest or desert, written into the cycles of deep time. The science of this hidden world reveals that these depths are not truly empty. Thermohaline circulation drags water downward, saturating the abyss with oxygen, shifting nutrients, burying heat. Subduction zones open trenches wider, swallowing seafloor into the mantle and recycling crust in cycles tens of millions of years long. This is where memory meets erasure most directly, the ocean floor recording sediments for a time, only to pull them down into the planet's heat when the cycle demands renewal. Fossils, chemicals, even fragments of civilizations lost to rising seas, all might one day slide into this silence, erased by tectonics, returned to magma, forgotten. Deep time does not weep for its losses. It simply begins again. Yet in this forgetting, there is creation. Hydrothermal vents, the abyss, black smokers rising like ghostly chimneys, pouring minerals into the dark. Here, life thrives without sunlight, existing on chemistry alone, fueled by sulfur and heat from Earth's interior. Entire ecosystems flourish unseen, teaching us that life's resilience is greater than the confines of light, greater than the fragility of photosynthesis. Could it be that the first spark of life came from such places, not from golden shores but from the unseen furnace of the abyss? And if so, then perhaps the future of life, long after sunlight fades, lies here as well, in darkness rich with possibility. To descend into this world is to lose perception of time. Minutes stretch, hours dissolve, for there are no rising suns to measure, no shadows to anchor the day. The abyss has no clock but pressure, no rhythm but the slow settling of silt. And so, it feels like forever. Perhaps this is why the depths hold such power in our imagination. They embody eternity, an eternal pause in the planet's breathing, a realm both alive and entropic, both present and erased. And yet, the abyss is not detached from us. Its mysteries ripple upward. Climate itself is tied to how these waters move, how they bury carbon, how they circulate heat. When the deep ocean shifts, so too do the patterns of ice, storm, and season above. The unseen shapes the scene. Silence builds the storm. The abyss may be hidden, but it is never absent. Perhaps what unsettles us most is not its remoteness but its intimacy, that the future of the surface is written in the stillness of the floor below, in trenches where our eyes will never look. So we imagine diving further, into a place with no horizon, no shore to stop us, only endless descent. The abyss is entropy, where everything sinks, where memory itself is muffled. And yet, it is also promise, the promise of beginnings we do not understand, of resilience that thrives without light, of futures not yet written. And as we rise slowly back into thought, leaving this trench behind, the question lingers. If the abyss can erase and create at once, if it can hold both silence and renewal, then what fragile anchors of life could cling above it? What fragile homes might drift on the surface, rewriting existence without ever touching solid ground? If the abyss can erase and create at once, if it can hold both silence and renewal, then what fragile anchors of life could cling above it? On a planet of endless water, with no continent to root upon, life would have to learn other ways to tether itself. Instead of forests climbing into air or roots clutching soil, existence would drift, sway, and adapt to whatever the ocean offered. And so we imagine colonies forming on rafts of kelp, vast mats weaving themselves like floating continents, green forests stretching flat across the surface, moved gently by currents and light. Perhaps islands of life would no longer be stone, but threads, leaves, shells, and branches, entwined and buoyant, perpetual travelers upon the waves. Science reminds us that even on Earth as we know it, such drifting ecosystems already exist. In patches of sargassum, a floating seaweed, whole communities of fish, crabs, turtles, and plankton find shelter, clinging to life suspended above darkness with no roots to hold them, no earth to fix them in place. In volcanic eddies too, where magma once burst from the seafloor, life collects around instability, feeding on nutrients carried upward. A water world would demand this on a vast scale. Every anchor would be temporary. Every forest would drift. Perhaps the boundary between life and current would disappear altogether. And what of memory? On our continents, stories are imprinted in rock, mountains carrying fossils as proof of what came before. But here, with no land to preserve bones and trees, memory would scatter across waves. A shell carried by tide, a feather lost to wind, a reef broken and absorbed into silt. These would be the libraries of the ocean, impermanent and constantly rewritten. The continuity of life would not be carved into cliffs but renewed in patterns of survival, told in repetition. Could we, in such a world, learn to think of memory not as permanence but as flow? Perhaps memory would be less about holding on to the past and more about carrying forward motion, sustaining fragility by never letting anything rest long enough to disappear. To live in this drifting existence would mean redefining roots. We might imagine beings that cling to giant kelp rafts, societies traveling with the currents, never in one place yet always within familiar pieces of ocean. Maybe their sense of home would not be tied to geography but to movement itself, to recognizing certain eddies, certain migratory patterns, the scent of a particular wind. Maybe home would not be a place but a journey, and identity would not be fixed but tidal. Still, fragility lingers. A storm could unravel an ecosystem in hours. A change in salinity could scatter a forest of kelp until it vanished beyond recognition. Life here would always live with awareness of impermanence. And yet, perhaps that awareness is also resilience. To exist without expecting permanence is to be free of disappointment when permanence dissolves. To anchor yourself to what drifts is to trust that the ocean carries on, no matter what form arrives or fades. Could that be a deeper kind of survival, not by fixing ourselves in place, but by traveling where the great breath of water carries us? And so, life clings delicately to the surface, fragile communities bound together by threads, by currents, by happenstance. Not because they are weak, but because the ocean teaches them to bend, to float, to scatter and return. Memory of land becomes only an echo, faint, like the shadow of stone glimpsed far below. What remains instead is movement, life anchored, paradoxically, by its inability to ever stay still. But if life itself can drift upon the surface without soil, if fragile anchors can braid themselves from kelp and current, then the question lingers, what kind of architecture might endure when no continent rises to support it? In the emptiness of ocean, who becomes the builder? Who becomes the patient architect of shelter? The answer, whispered in silent reefs across our own world, is coral. Without continents, reefs would not simply exist as habitats among many. They would become the great cities of a water planet, luminous citadels rising from silence, seeding color and refuge across an otherwise unbroken void. Picture them growing, not hurried, but with the slowness only living stone knows. Each coral polyp, a tiny creature no larger than a match head, spins its own skeleton of calcium carbonate, secreted quietly from seawater. One by one, they build upon each other, their collected bones weaving into vast lattices of ridges, valleys, spires, labyrinths. What starts as microscopic colonies becomes continents of their own, though softer, stranger, more fragile. On a planet without land, corals would spread endlessly across seamounts, atolls, and volcanic shoulders, claiming every raised surface, every chance for foothold. If the world was nothing but sea, corals would paint its deserts with living stone. Science reminds us that reefs are more than beauty. They are filtration engines, cycle balancers, architects of symbiosis that stabilize ecosystems far greater than their size. They collect sunlight and turn it into life, their algae symbionts creating energy that feeds not only the coral itself but the intricate spirals of food chains relying on these structures. Thousands of species, fish, crustaceans, mollusks, threads of interdependence that would vanish without shelter. In a landless ocean, reefs would become the equivalent of forests, oases where diversity gathers, where memory is not carried in fossils, but in continuity of relationship. Perhaps in such a world, the coral city would be the only permanent place to return to, the only structure that endures against the otherwise fluid background. And yet, their permanence is deceptive. Corals, for all their resilience, are balanced on the sharp edge of chemistry. A slight shift in temperature, in acidity, in salinity, and their delicate architectures bleach, unravel, dissolve. They are memory keepers carved in stone, but memory vulnerable to entropy all the same. Could it be that the fragility of corals, rather than their strength, is what makes them profound? They endure not because they are invincible, but because they thread life together across thresholds so unstable, so uncertain. Their colonies whisper, survival lies not in resisting change, but in living with it. And we might ask, if humans were to drift in such a water world, would we not seek safety near reefs, anchoring our rafts to their edges, learning their rhythms as maps? Cities of coral would be our harbors, places where we could weave continuity in a planet without land. We might come to measure our lives by the health of these reefs, looking into their labyrinths the way our ancestors once looked into fire. Maybe we would come to think of them not as background, but as companions, living continents of patience, silent but essential. There is also something else about reefs. They preserve memory without trying. Their skeletons remain long after the polyps die, layer upon layer creating a geological archive of both life and environment. Oxygen isotopes etched into their skeletons tell of shifting seas, of past temperatures, of fluctuations in climate. In a water-bound Earth, these records would become the geology itself. Stone without mountain, archive without cliff, memory engraved in living carbonate instead of granite. Corals, then, are both fragile shelters of now and historians of forever. And if whole reefs can rise into cathedrals of silence, if cities can grow from creatures smaller than a grain of rice, then what other reminders would cling to this endless ocean? Not monuments of human stone, nor ruins of past civilizations, but remnants of ourselves written in ways we do not intend. If corals are natural archivists, what, then, becomes of the traces of us? Could even our forgotten debris, drowned in the water, become its own fossilized city, our unintentional monument beneath the sea? If corals are natural archivists, leaving their skeletons as cathedrals of memory across the ocean floor, then what would remain of us in a world drowned by water? If our continents vanished, If our cities sank beneath rising tides, what traces would endure in the silence below? Perhaps our ruins would become reefs of their own, accidental monuments woven from rust and concrete, steel beams turned into artificial skeletons where fish seek shelter. Our memory persisted not through story but through architecture left behind. One generation's city might become another generation's labyrinth of coral, each avenue softened by time until it is unrecognizable, yet still present, still shaping ecosystems long after we are gone. Science already names such remnants technofossils. They are objects made by us, durable enough to outlast lives and perhaps entire species. Fragments of plastic, buried in beach sands, pressed into rock. Layers of concrete, synthetic fibers, aluminum, glass, materials unlikely to dissolve in any single epoch. In the deep future, when geologists carve into layers of stone, they may find not only ammonites or foraminifera but bottle caps and silicon circuits, recorded just as faithfully in the strata. For a water world, where so much natural fossilization is erased by subduction and pressure, perhaps it is technofossils that would become the truest storytellers of our presence, a record more durable than bone. Imagine a skyline submerged, towers dark except for the faint glow of bioluminescent life weaving between their windows. Streets drowned, yet turned to avenues for schools of fish. Bridges weighed down by coral growth. Highways transformed into ridges of mossy carbonate. A city of silence, its echoes stripped not by demolition, but by pressure, salt, and time. And with careless irony, some of our most resilient marks may not be the monuments we built with grandeur, but the waste we left behind. Plastic drifters, microfibers, and lost fragments of polymer drifting across gyres. Woven into sediments, imprinted into geology, seeds of our time scattered across epochs we will never see. Perhaps in this way our memory will travel further than our voices. Deep time may carry our plastic into new strata, pressed into stone beside ancient fossils. Future beings, whatever they may be, could stumble across these layers and wonder at the imbalance they represent. Why so sudden? Why so widespread? Could it be that our legacy will not be our art, our languages, our myths, but this thin film of synthetic dust, this unmistakable line marking the Anthropocene as a unique pause in planetary history? Not because of its beauty, but because its presence is undeniable. And yet, there is poetry even in this quiet ruin. Just as volcanic ash captures forests, just as meteorite dust records sudden endings, so too might our traces be folded into the memory of the earth. It is not for us to decide how those traces will be understood. Monument, warning, curiosity, or perhaps nothing at all. Layers are impartial. They carry what they are given, not what was meant. Could it be that memory does not belong to us at all, but only passes through us, carried onward until the next layer folds over? So in this strange reflection we are reminded, it is not only natural organisms that fossilize, but civilizations themselves. Our world is fragile, yet the materials we shape from it have found ways to outlast us. Subduction will eventually take them, entropy will erode them, but in the meantime, in the long hush between now and then, they persist. Towers rusting into reefs, concrete fractured into ridges, glass melted by pressure into smooth, unbroken plains. We may not recognize them, but they will exist. And if future observers, whether human descendants or some other intelligence, ever find these technofossils, what will they conclude? Would they see continuity, admiration for what once stood? Or would our ruins feel like warnings, boundaries marking a vanished age? Maybe they would feel neither. Maybe they would see only fragments, scattered among coral reefs and fossil shells, and wonder how many other civilizations, on other worlds of water, also left their silent technofossils behind. And so the thought drifts quietly with us. If even ruins can become memory, if silence can preserve our traces as faithfully as stone, then what happens when the ocean folds it all back into itself? If our legacy is built from fragments of plastic and crumbling towers, what of the things water destroys entirely, without leaving a single imprint behind? If our legacy could sink into technofossils, If towers could rust into reefs and plastic could be pressed into stone, then what of the things water does not preserve? For water does not only archive, it also erases. It drifts across ruins with patient touch, softening sharpness, smoothing edges, and eventually carrying memory into silence. In a water world, this cycle would be everywhere, an endless choreography of drift, decay, and renewal. Water is both kindness and damage. It nourishes the plankton that feed whales. It sustains corals as they build their living fortresses. Yet it also breaks apart the very skeletons that rise against it. Steel succumbs to rust, stone dissolves grain by grain, and glass fractures beneath waves and pressure. Even monuments designed to last falter in its embrace. And still, life flourishes within this very erosion. The decay of one form becomes the nourishment of another. The drift of fragments becomes the current's way of feeding countless beings. Perhaps this is the paradox of water. Not one of destruction or creation, but of both, inseparably bound. Science shows us this cycle in motion. Sediments carry the dust of mountains ground down into the sea, recycling themselves across millions of years. Rivers bring nutrients outward. Tides carry them back again. Hydrothermal vents consume old crust and release minerals that form the base of ecosystems. Even death itself drifts, with bodies of whales falling into the abyss, slowly transforming from solemn corpse to thriving reef, sustaining entire communities for decades. From molecules to continents, water takes apart as it gives, moves away as it returns. Not because it decides, but because it can do nothing else. And yet, for all its rhythms, there is something bewildering about this endless balance. If everything is undone, if entropy waits within every form, then what does it mean to last? Is renewal simply another kind of memory, an imprint that survives not in permanence, but in cycles that reshape, dissolve, and repeat? Could water be teaching us that nothing is ever truly lost, but nothing remains in the way we expect? Maybe permanence is not about resisting decay but about continuing within it, transforming from one form into another, like waves that vanish only to appear again, shifted but recognizable. To live in such a world would mean loosening our grip on linear time. Instead of thinking in beginnings and endings, we would learn to think in returns, in drifts that carry what once dissolved back into new patterns. A coral reef grows from decay. A fish finds shelter in fractured ruins. Salt carries remnants of countless dissolutions across the whole ocean. Creation and erasure blur, becoming one continuous breath. In this way, water itself is the reminder that no boundary is final, no ending absolute. And when we picture our drowned traces, towers melted, roads crumbled, plastics softened into geologic seams, we begin to wonder, are these ruins destroyed, or are they simply continuing, becoming parts of the ocean's larger story? What looks like forgetting may be another kind of remembering, not static but fluid, not archived but circulated. Perhaps even our own remains, like fossils before us, are not erased but rewritten. And still, the image lingers gently. Rafts of life drifting in the present, ruins dissolving into the past, new patterns awakening in their place. Drift, decay, renewal, each inseparable from the others, each carrying a fragment of time forward. And so we are left with the question that hovers like salt in the air. If the ocean can recycle even ruins into nourishment, even silence into motion, then what other cycles of creation might unfold from destruction? If water can blur destruction and creation into a single cycle, if it can turn ruins into nourishment and endings into new beginnings, then what of the climate itself on a world without land? What breath would the atmosphere take when no continent interrupts the flow, when no coastline redirects a storm, when the winds find nothing but water to cross? In such a world, weather would not be broken up into regions or seasons as we know them. It would spiral endlessly, vast loops of storm and sky, each unhindered by the boundaries we take for granted. Hurricanes as we know them gather power from warm seas, rising into spirals of wind before breaking apart as they strike land. But here there is no land, no mountain to break their spin, no shore to scatter their momentum. Imagine storms that never die, not in hours or days, but in years. gigantic gyres spiraling endlessly, hurricanes becoming permanent features of the atmosphere, churning like planetary gears, their eye walls glowing with lightning that rumbles and fades again. They would not be disasters in the way we think of them, but structures, climates, architecture, a clockwork not of stone but of air and water. Science tells us that water vapor is the strongest greenhouse contributor on Earth. Without land to anchor temperatures, evaporation here would be immense. Clouds thickening, spreading, blanketing skies across hemispheres. Perhaps entire belts of storm would circle the planet, each one feeding the next, energy transferred in an endless cycle. In a world like this, the line between ocean and atmosphere would blur completely. The sea would rise into the sky in vapor while the sky returned as storms to the sea, an unbroken dialogue of exchange. Could it be that in such a system, atmosphere and ocean cease to be two separate realms and become one continuous body, breathing through currents and clouds alike? It is easy to picture chaos in this thought, but maybe chaos is only our word for an order too large to recognize. Each storm would have its own rhythm, its own orbit across the surface of the globe. Together, they would weave a pattern as predictable as tides. Hurricanes, instead of short-lived spirals of destruction, would be part of a planetary dance, distributing heat, gases, and freshwater rains across regions we can only imagine. To watch them from above would be to see a world alive with whirling geometry. Storms not as threats but as stabilizers, atmospheric organs keeping balance in the endless sea. And yet, fragility lingers in this thought. For storms would also mean erosion on a scale never seen before, waves continually striking volcanic ridges and coral citadels until they vanish beneath the churn. Nothing would rise for long. Even the strongest architecture of life would bend beneath constant winds. There would be no still landscapes, only moments of uneasy calm before the cycle began again, before the rising swirl of vapor returned in renewed fury. Life that survived here would have to belong to motion, evolving not against the storm but with it, finding quiet only in the spaces between. Perhaps in such conditions, memory itself would feel different. On land, we learn to measure history by layers of stone and soil. But in this world, where even coral is battered, where currents replace continents, memory might exist only in chemical signatures, in isotopes etched invisibly into shells, in patterns of carbon exchange hidden in the cycles of vapor. The storms would erase as much as they carried. What histories, we might wonder, would dissolve in these endless tempests? Could civilizations ever leave their imprints if every structure was scattered by a storm that never ended? Or would memory, in such a place, belong only to water itself? And there is a strange beauty in imagining such a planet. Viewed from space, it would glisten not as blue tranquility, but as silver turbulence, clouds swirling in constant choreography, surfaces shimmering with storm reflection. It would be alive in every breath, a world where the atmosphere moves not in seasons, but in unbroken spirals that turn without pause, without shore, without rest. And yet, if storms become clockwork gears, if climate itself becomes circular and endless, what becomes of the cold edges of this water world? The remote poles where silence might still resist the storm? Do even they hold stillness? Or do they, too, betray their permanence beneath the weight of such ceaseless change? And yet, if storms can spiral endlessly across the equator, if climate becomes circular and perpetual, what of the distant poles where silence lingers? Even on a world of water, edges remain. The currents slow, the winds disperse, and cold gathers in its patient dominion. There, at the very top and bottom of the globe, ice still holds its fragile reign, floating as pale fragments of solidity in a universe otherwise drowned. These frozen sheets are not continents as we know them, but they are the last suggestions of permanence, delicate echoes of stone remembered in crystalline form. To drift among them would be to drift into memory itself. Their surfaces glisten against the dark ocean like mirrors ground from centuries of snow, each layer recording the breath of the atmosphere at the moment it was laid. Trapped within the ice, bubbles of carbon dioxide and oxygen wait like whispers from forgotten ages. Scientists who core into glaciers uncover timelines written not in words but in frozen air, archives stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Even on a water world, this would remain true. The poles as libraries of sky, preserving the voices of past climates in each layered stratum of ice. The frozen edges would be both a recorder and a reminder that change is constant and erasure is never complete. But like all memory, ice is fragile. We know from our own Earth that it advances and retreats with every swing of climate. During glacial epochs, sea levels fall as the planet's water is gathered into frozen mass. During warm intervals, the ice dissolves, returning its memory to the sea. On a water world, these cycles might be magnified. With no land to anchor the cold, the ice may float and fracture more easily, vast plateaus drifting as glaciers adrift from their moorings. Each piece would carry its own fossil air, each fragment collapsing into melt, its story released back into atmosphere before sinking invisibly into the balance of the planet. And perhaps that is where the wonder lies. Ice cannot last forever, but it refuses to vanish without leaving something behind. Isotopes hidden within each flake of snow preserve information about temperature, about storms, about levels of dust in the sky. They tell us how the Earth tilted on its axis, how the sun's warmth rose and fell over ages, how climates wove their shifting patterns. Could it be that frozen water remembers more faithfully than solid stone? Stone erodes, drifts, and subducts beneath tectonic plates, but ice, in its brief tenure, preserves atmosphere itself. Transient, delicate, yet astonishingly clear. Memory, it seems, sometimes resides most securely in things that appear weakest. If we linger long enough at the poles of such a world, the vastness of ice begins to soften into silence. The storms of the equator are hushed here, muffled beneath the grandeur of frozen plains. Standing upon them, surrounded by horizon after horizon of white, one might forget the planet below is water at all. Perhaps in moments like that, we would understand the word stillness anew, not as absence of motion, but as presence so complete that everything within it falls quiet. And yet the thought returns, fragile, undeniable. Ice is only a visitor. It does not build, it does not root, it drifts, it melts, it gives itself back to the cycle again and again. To imagine our water planet is to imagine ice only as temporary inheritance. Here for a span of time, then vanished, then back again. A reminder that even solidity can be a mirage, an echo pretending to be land. And so we drift away from these frozen memories at the edges of the world, holding their silence with us. For if the poles can offer archives of sky, storing voices of climates beyond imagination, what of the spaces where no such boundaries exist at all? What of erosion, which continues everywhere beneath the sea, not carving cliffs or canyons, but reshaping the very floor of the abyss? And if ice, even at the planet's edges, can preserve memory for a time before releasing it back to the sea, then what of the ceaseless forces that erase? On a world without continents, erosion itself would change its meaning. For without rivers carving valleys, without cliffs crumbling into waves, without mountains shedding their weight grain by grain, there is no familiar drama of loss. Instead, the process softens, almost invisible, so slow it feels like stillness. Sediment, released from fragments of coral, from volcanic ridges, from the faint collapse of drifting islands, would not gather into familiar deltas or beaches. It would sink directly into the abyss. A quiet rain of dissolution, smoothing the ocean floor into something featureless, like a page wiped clean again and again. Geology tells us that on Earth as we know it, erosion is painter and sculptor, carving mountains sharp, then sanding them into round hills, balancing land and sea through unbroken patience. But here, there are no vast river networks to stream life into oceans, no canyons of stone to archive the ages of their exposure. Instead, erosion flows in silence, a downward drift. The planet's surface beneath the waves fills slowly with blankets of marine snow, fragments of dust, bone, and silt mingling together, compressing into sedimentary layers. With no continent to interrupt, the abyssal plain spreads endlessly, uniform and desolate, swallowing detail beneath its weight. Could it be that this uniformity is itself a kind of forgetting, a way for a planet to smooth over the complications of its own story? And yet, even in uniformity, faint lines remain. Sediment captures isotopes, pollen carried on air, even shards from meteorites that fall into the waters. In cross-sections taken millions of years later, these thin layers become quiet pages of record, telling when the world was warm, when species bloomed, when oceans were suffused with carbon or with oxygen. Still, they lack the sharpness of cliffs, the immediacy of strata exposed on dry land. Their record is muffled, buried deep, like a memory carried but never spoken aloud. Perhaps this is the entropy of a water world. Not destruction and violence, but erosion as gentle leveling. Not because forces are absent, but because they diffuse across too wide a canvas, spreading difference until it dissolves into uniformity. Maybe erosion itself becomes invisible here, indistinguishable from the calmness of the sea. And yet, if everything is smooth, if detail is lost, then how do we measure time? Without cliffs or canyons, without stones to expose the scars of ages, do we remember less of what the planet has been? Or does memory shift elsewhere, into water, into isotopes, into drifting currents that bind history not to rock but to flow? There is humility in imagining this. We cherish landscapes carved by rivers, mountains standing as ancient sculpture, but perhaps they are only temporary accents on Earth's face. Erosion without shorelines teaches that, ultimately, the planet seeks balance. Every jagged summit, every fragment of coral tower, is drawn sooner or later back into uniform depths, carried down by weight until the differences between them no longer matter. Silence is its sculptor. Leveling is its law. And as the thought drifts deeper, we find ourselves asking, if every stone is eventually smoothed, if every trace of land is erased, then what else dissolves with them? How do we exist in memory if the very stage of history, the ground beneath stories, is swallowed into sameness? Perhaps the answer waits not in erosion itself, but in those who still dare to sing across the emptiness left behind. And if erosion can smooth every ridge and silence every cliff, if memory itself can sink into soft uniformity, then who remains to break that silence? In a water world without land, perhaps the most enduring voices would belong to the whales. For whales do not carve valleys or leave monuments, but they carry their presence across the sea in sound. In endless oceans, without coastlines to absorb or scatter them, their voices would travel farther than ever, each song stretching unbroken across horizons until one ocean folded into the next. Imagine it, the planet waking not to wind in trees or rivers moving through valleys, but to long, resonant tones drifting through blue. Deep moans, woven with harmonics, pulsing slowly through the water like a living metronome. To us they are music, to the whales they are language, a way of remembering each other across vast fields of distance. In our world, a single humpback song can travel hundreds of miles. On a planet of uninterrupted water, how much farther? Could the slow chorus of whales encircle the globe, a choir without end, a planetary voice stronger than any human archive? Science tells us that low-frequency sound moves easily through water, refracting along thermoclines, bouncing between layers of density and warmth, traveling unimaginably far. In fact, some scientists call it the deep sound channel, a kind of natural waveguide in the ocean where the voices of whales can travel across basins, connecting pods separated by 1,000 miles. In a world where sea holds dominion, that channel might become the choir's cathedral, a resonance chamber bigger than any canyon carved on land. And these songs are not simple. They carry phrases, repetitions, and structures that evolve over years, shared from one group to another like driftwood passed between tides. Each season, patterns change. Some notes lengthened, others dropped, echoes of the previous woven into the next. Could it be that the songs themselves are memory, a living fossil that preserves what rock and ice do not? Perhaps whales are archivists of sound, carrying knowledge across lifetimes, their verse layered not in strata of stone but in patterns of tune. In a water world, without continents, such communication might grow even stronger. No land to block frequencies, no interruptions between seas. The language of whales would spread seamlessly, perhaps synchronizing across global populations. Entire species might share one planetary song, unified in a chorus that outlasts centuries, an inheritance of melody passed to the young before they even begin to migrate. What oceans could not keep in stone, they might keep in sound. Philosophers might say this is what memory feels like when it is alive. It does not sit still. It does not harden into fossils or frozen cores. It moves, loops, evolves, never finished. Whale song, like planetary currents, like drifting isotopes, is a diary without pages, a narration that cannot be boxed, only listened to. Maybe this is why their voices feel so haunting when we hear them, because they remind us of time outside of ourselves, of continuity unbroken by human borders. And yet, drift carries weight. For even whales are not beyond entropy. Noise spreads in the ocean, storms grow, and lives to end, returning their bodies to the abyss. But their sound remains, passed on, reshaped, alive in another. Could it be that, in them, we glimpse a different kind of permanence, not through materials, not through preservation, but through repetition? Not because a note lasts, but because it is sung again, and again, and again. So the choir stretches, breaking the uniform silence erosion leaves behind, carrying history more fluidly than stone ever could. Songs that might once have reached only to a horizon now loop across the planet, filling the void with living resonance. And as we listen, lulled, carried by their sound, we ask ourselves quietly, if memory can be kept in song, if meaning can survive only as vibration passing through water, then what other voices might rise from the ocean's deep, not as melody but as pulse, as heat, as hidden breath in places where no song has ever been heard? If whales carry the ocean's music in endless song, reminding us that memory can live in sound and repetition, then what of the voices too deep to sing? What of the breath that comes not from lungs, but from earth itself? In the darkness of the ocean floor, where no light can reach and silence reigns heavier than any night sky, something else speaks. At the deepest trenches, hidden in chasms colder than ice, black smokers rise from the seabed like cathedral pillars, their plumes unfurling into the abyss. They are hydrothermal springs, funnels of heat and chemistry, the secret pulse of a planet that never stops exhaling. From cracks in the Earth's crust, seawater seeps downward, drawn into stone fractured by tectonic strain. It plunges into layers heated by magma, absorbing minerals as it is boiled under unimaginable pressure, then is thrust back upward, erupting into the deep like breath escaping through sacred chimneys. What emerges is a plume dense with iron, sulfur, and metals, a warmth that presses outward into the cold ocean as if the planet itself were sighing into eternity. To wander here, even in imagination, is to stand before monuments not carved by hand but by heat, pillars blackened and encrusted by the minerals they release, delicate yet towering, fragile yet monumental. Science tells us that here, at these vents, is one of Earth's oldest secrets of life. Without sunlight, photosynthesis cannot sustain. Instead, communities here depend on chemosynthesis, bacteria thriving on chemistry, turning sulfur into energy, feeding creatures adapted to darkness. Giant tube worms anchored in silence, pale crabs wandering across mineral ridges, delicate shrimp harvesting invisible flows, all enduring because chemistry made a different kind of abundance possible. Could this be where life began, not in sunlight scattered across shallow shores, but in the warm breath of the deep, nurtured by stone and water together? And if so, what does it mean for us? That existence itself might have first kindled in a place where no eye could see, no ear could hear, no surface ever broke into day. In a water world, without land and without light, such springs would not be anomalies. They would be anchors of stability, sanctuaries in the abyss. Perhaps entire ecosystems, whole arcs of evolution, would depend on them alone. Islands of chemistry in a sea of silence. Lighthouses without flame, but radiant in the way they sustain life. And in their plumes of superheated water, spreading nutrients into surrounding depths, they would write continuity where otherwise there would only be stillness. Could it be that here, life would not just endure, but even thrive, defying the emptiness by making darkness its cradle? Geologists suggest vents may shift with tectonic motion, collapsing and reforming as plates move, as crust stretches and tears. Entire communities vanish when a vent dies, only for new communities to flourish when another is born. Not permanence, but perpetual renewal. Perhaps this is the lesson of the hydrothermal world. Nothing survives unchanged, and yet life returns again and again wherever energy and chemistry find a way to meet. Renewal is not a choice, it is inevitability. Maybe even memory itself works this way. Not preserved once and for all, but constantly disappearing and reappearing, reshaped each time. And there is something almost holy about the image. Black chimneys rising out of endless dark, sulfur and iron streaming into plumes that shine faintly as minerals precipitate. They resemble altars, fragile yet eternal, built not by intention but by process, by the ceaseless dialogue between rock and ocean. And around them, living beings more alien than imagination, yet real enough to remind us that strangeness is not distant. It thrives beneath our very seas. In their slow rhythm, hydrothermal springs become the ocean's hidden heartbeat. Not loud, not visible, but steady and undeniable. Each plume is an exhale, releasing heat to balance the crushing cold, offering energy where otherwise there is entropy. To imagine drifting here is to imagine the planet itself breathing in cycles deeper than human thought can follow. Perhaps this, too, is memory. Not stored in stone or sound, but whispered in heat, in pulses of chemistry, in quiet gifts that sustain what should not be able to live at all. And as we turn from these vents, from their pillars in the dark cathedral of the abyss, we begin to sense what lies beyond. Not sound, not chemical pulse, but something harder to grasp, a strange dimension of time itself. If life clings here, enduring where darkness erases almost everything, then how does time unfold in such silence? How do we measure existence when there is no rising sun, no shifting seasons, no shorelines to weather? If hydrothermal springs are the planet's hidden heartbeat, pulsing in the dark where no day ever breaks, then the question emerges softly. How do we measure time in a world that offers no landmarks? On land, cliffs and rivers and mountains remind us of endings and beginnings, of ages that rise and erode, of seasons etched into the landscape like scars. But in a water world, these markers dissolve. There are no ridges to climb, no dunes to shift in wind, no valleys to deepen with every year. There is only water stretched endlessly in every direction, its face changing too quickly to preserve, its body too vast to anchor thought. Time itself unspools differently, unmoored, unframed. Look long enough at an ocean surface, and you will see it flicker with change. Waves climbing, breaking, fading, replaced. A minute is marked by ripples, an hour by tides, a season by storms. But beneath, in the miles of water where sunlight never touches, nothing shifts in ways we grasp. The abyss has no clock. Plants do not bloom. Shadows do not crawl. The darkness is constant, the silence unbroken, making centuries feel no different from seconds. Could it be that without landmarks, time is not measured at all, but absorbed, dissolving like salt into water? Perhaps memory itself fades in such a place, because there is nothing solid for it to cling to. Science offers glimpses of how time is recorded even here. Sediments accumulate slowly, a rain of dust and shells falling into the abyss, each layer thinner than a page yet stretching across thousands of years. Isotopes shift with climate, preserving in chemistry what topography cannot. But these are hidden diaries, invisible without tools, without patience. To the eye and the body floating in a water world, time feels seamless, endless, as though the planet exists not as a sequence of moments but as an eternal present. Maybe this is why oceans feel hypnotic to us. They erase the urgency of now, reminding us that memory is built upon contrast, and without contrast, time feels like sleep. And yet, even sleep is not timeless. It drifts and cycles, like waves repeating endlessly. A water planet might feel like that, a consciousness suspended, lulled by sameness but still moving quietly beneath. Could we, if we lived only on such a sphere, learn to tell time by motion instead of permanence, by the looping return of currents, by the breathing of whales, by the pulses of hydrothermal springs, our calendars would not be carved into stone, but sung, swum, whispered into patterns too fluid to capture. Perhaps we would stop counting altogether and simply drift, each moment dissolving graciously into the one that follows. But what of memory without edges? If we do not mark days by sunsets, if we do not find centuries pressed into cliffsides, what is remembered at all? Would identity itself become softer, less insistent, more dreamlike? Maybe in such a world, memory would not be about holding on to stories but about letting them ebb and flow. Not permanence but circulation. Not fossils gripped in rock, but voices carried in sound or fragments carried in current. It might be unsettling, but it might also be peace, the acceptance that nothing needs to be fixed to be real. And still, as comforting as this thought becomes, another rises with it. If time can dissolve so easily, if landmarks vanish into uniformity, then how do we recognize decay? How do we sense entropy moving through the water, reducing structures, unraveling life? Perhaps only in the absence of song, in the fading of patterns, would we finally notice time's passage. Not because stones split open to remind us, but because silence deepened where once there had been voice. And so the ocean holds us in its dream, endless surface, endless depth, dissolving landmarks and leaving us to float in the measureless present. But if time itself can blur into water, if memory dissolves into drift, then what happens when even drift is consumed? What does the ocean teach us about entropy when there is nothing left to measure its erosion by? If time itself can blur into water, if memory dissolves without landmarks, then what remains is the slow certainty of decay. For everything, even here, must yield. Entropy does not stop at the ocean's edge. It lingers in the salt, in the slow grinding of minerals, in the quiet unraveling of forms. In an endless sea where permanence is already rare, the slow process of loss becomes both more subtle and more complete. Salt itself is an archivist, storing traces of life dissolved into ions. Every breath exhaled, every reef crumbled, every living body returned to the water contributes to this silent archive. Layer upon layer, the ocean becomes a vast solution of memory, but memory diluted, memory scattered beyond recognition. Perhaps this is entropy at its gentlest. Not destruction with violence, but disappearance by dispersal, until what once seemed whole is stretched too thin to be grasped. Currents carry fragments of the past farther than our imaginations allow. A single shell, crushed into dust, drifts along the thermohaline cycles, scattered into grains so small they dissolve into invisibility. The remains of forests, of creatures, of civilizations lost to the flood, might all be absorbed this way, not because they are unworthy of remembrance, but because water carries no preference. It moves everything with the same patience. Even fossils that form beneath the seafloor, pressed into sediment, are not spared. Subduction pulls them downward, recycling them in silence, replacing their imprints with new ones or erasing them entirely. Perhaps what unsettles us is the realization that the planet remembers through layers, yet forgets through the same act of layering. Science shows us hints of this quiet dissolution. Sediment cores reveal pollen distributed across oceans, volcanic ash smeared thin into layers of silt, whispers of entire ice ages faintly visible in chemical ratios. Yet most of what once was is lost outright, dissolved before it is ever recorded. Entropy in the sea works differently than on land. Here it does not topple cliffs or strip soil, but diffuses distinctions until uniqueness fades into fluid sameness. The remarkable becomes ordinary, then untraceable. And in this, perhaps, lies the most profound truth. The ocean does not keep everything. Too allows forgetting. But not all forgetting is absence. Sometimes what disappears from form persists as pattern. Dissolved salts circulate endlessly, re-entering the cycles of life again and again, forming shells, bones, reefs, only to dissolve again. Information may vanish, but ingredients remain. Could this be another face of memory? Not permanence, not fossilization, but recursive return. Maybe entropy on a water world is not an ending, but a redistribution, threads of history woven into new forms before vanishing again. Not because they endure, but because they pass forward. Philosophically, the thought is both unsettling and strangely comforting. What if our greatest legacies are not the monuments or fossils we leave, but the fragments carried unseen into future forms? The calcium from the bones of forgotten creatures becoming coral lattice. The carbon from drowned forests feeding bacteria in the abyss. The salts of civilizations dissolved into ocean, indistinguishable from the salts of stars. Could it be that identity itself surrenders here, washed not into absence but into universality? Perhaps this is what the ocean teaches better than stone. That selfhood drifts until it blends, that separation is only temporary. And yet, for all this dissolving, salt itself endures. The ocean has grown saltier across deep time, a cumulative record of every erosion, every decay, every memory released. In that sense, salt is both decay embodied and permanence hauntingly achieved. Every wave that crashes carries fragments of what has gone before, even if we cannot see them. Every drop contains a little of the past, endlessly shared, endlessly unfinished. So entropy builds its dominion in the endless blue, not through violence, but through gentleness, through dispersal, through unhurried erasure. And drifting in that thought, one cannot help but wonder. If everything dissolves, if all memory scatters and nothing resists being carried away, then what of the forests drowned long ago? Do their voices still linger below, or have even they been rewritten into silence beneath the waves? If everything dissolves, if memory scatters through salt and currents, then what of the forests drowned long ago? Do their voices still linger below, or have they been rewritten into silence beneath the waves? Submerged beneath layers of water and silt, forests once alive with birdsong and wind now rest in a stillness deeper than forgetting. Their trunks, once supple with sap, are darkened into coal or transformed into stone, time layering them gently until they are no longer trees but imprints. They wait with quiet patience in the abyss, not breathing, not growing, yet not entirely gone. All across our earth, science has uncovered these remnants. Sunken groves preserved beneath ancient lakes, riverbeds that once cradled woodlands now hidden below coasts, peaty beds trapped under modern seas. There are places where entire stumps remain, their roots intact, their rings still visible, as though frozen in sleep. Geology whispers through them of long-vanished landscapes. Valleys drowned by glaciers melting, plains consumed by rising tides, wetlands buried under silt. Each drowned forest is a fragment of the world as it was, a page in a history book the ocean never fully erased. What we see as stone was once green. What we think of as coal was once sunlight captured by leaves. The memory of trees compressed into black seams that warmed ages we cannot recall. And yet, memory changes here. Fossil logs become quartz, entire trunks transfigured into mineral replicas, every ring preserved, every grain crystallized. They look the same, but they are no longer themselves. Perhaps this is how the earth remembers with transformation, not by freezing the past as it was, but by allowing it to shift into something new. The forgotten forests below remind us that change is not always loss. Sometimes it is translation, one form of existence rewritten into another, still whispering to those who know how to read it. Still, one cannot help but imagine the silence that fell when they first drowned. Roots suffocating beneath water, canopies folding into waves, entire ecosystems vanishing under the slow advance of tide. How many creatures fled? How many lives reshaped themselves or dissolved outright as the waters climbed higher? In that drowning, whole worlds must have felt erased. Yet their imprints remain to us now as coal, as stone, as isotopes locked into sediment. Could it be that all extinction carries this double truth, that what disappears also becomes a foundation for what comes next? Life layered upon life, death layered into renewal. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these submerged forests is their invisibility. Most lie hidden, never seen, existing only in whispers from seabeds or fragments washed ashore. And yet, The idea of them tugs at us. The notion that beneath quiet harbors or inland lakes lies the ghost of a vanished grove, trees standing unseen, branches long gone but roots still clinging to soil that no longer breathes air. They are forests we cannot walk, landscapes that live only in imagination and evidence, but their presence stirs something deep in us. Maybe because they remind us that memory is never entirely erased. It is only submerged, waiting beneath silence. And so, the forgotten forests below remain both absent and eternal. Their trunks are coal, their roots silt, their rings a diary of climates gone. They are fossils without breath yet with endurance, memory absorbed deeply into Earth's quiet processes. And as we drift between these thoughts, a question emerges. If entire forests can be drowned and still remembered in stone, if their memory can live beneath millennia of silence, then what other eruptions of Earth's fire still rise through the water, breaking briefly into islands before sinking again? If entire forests can be drowned and still remembered in stone, if silence can preserve them as echoes beneath the waves, then what of the world's opposite memory? Fire rising through water? For even in a planet of oceans, the Earth does not sleep beneath its mantle. Its molten heart still trembles, fractures, and exhales. And sometimes, where the seabed cracks and magma surges forth, fire breaks through the dominion of blue. Volcanic islands are born, sudden interruptions in the ocean's continuity, fleeting sparks of stone that remind us the Earth is always rewriting itself. To witness such a birth is to glimpse both violence and tenderness at once. Beneath the waves, pressure builds as magma gathers, then bursts through. Bubbles expand, ash rises, lava finds form against the water's unimaginable weight, and slowly, through countless eruptions, a ridge grows upward until a summit touches the surface. In that instant, what was only abyss becomes horizon, and the ocean gains a shore where none existed before. Islands born this way do not arrive gently. They emerge in clouds of steam and boiling water, their stones hissing at the contact with waves. And yet, for the first time, they offer solidity, the feeling of land where land has been forgotten. Science teaches that such islands are fragile, their lifespans uncertain. Some vanish within years, eroded by waves before their names are even remembered. Others endure long enough to host life. Moss carried by currents, birds resting on black sand, seeds finding cracks in hot basalt. Coral eventually encircles them, reefs building new ecosystems upon surfaces that were inaccessible only moments before. Perhaps this is how resilience looks on a planetary scale. Not permanence, but emergence, brief yet meaningful, ephemeral yet real. Might it be that in a world of water, these volcanic islands become the rhythm of hope, little promises rising from the deep even if only to vanish again? The geology here reminds us of subduction, the constant recycling of crust. Old ocean floor slips beneath tectonic plates, consumed into the mantle, only for its materials to reappear in eruptions elsewhere. Even destruction feeds creation, even burial ensures rebirth. The volcanic island is not a coincidence but an inevitability of the Earth's restless cycle, a proof that nothing is ever fully lost beneath stone. Could it be that these islands are not interruptions at all, but reminders, small, fiery voices insisting that even oceans cannot smother renewal completely? Philosophically, to stand on such a young island feels like standing at the edge of time itself. The rock beneath your feet has never been touched by air until now. It is Earth's most recent breath, a surface new enough to still radiate heat. There is awe in this rawness, a kind of humility that comes from knowing you are present at the beginning of something that will also one day end. Not because of choice, but because nothing escapes entropy. Waves grind the sharp edges away. Rain and salt carve it into sand. Eventually, the same ocean that permitted the island's rise pulls it back into itself. Maybe the lesson here is simple. Creation is always temporary, but temporariness is no less meaningful. On a water world, where permanence is rare and memory is drowned, volcanic islands become stories of emergence. They do not last, but they remind the sea of the fire beneath it, the restless force that cannot be stilled. Life, too, may gather on them briefly, only to scatter again when they are swallowed. And perhaps civilizations, if they ever rose here, would have to accept this rhythm as truth, that the ground beneath their homes was borrowed, destined to return to the current silence. Could identity survive if everything one built was fated to sink? Or would identity reshape itself to drift, to rise and fall like the islands themselves, never clinging too tightly to permanence? And so we watch them appear and vanish, these volcanic births. Black stone gleaming wet under sunlight, then broken, then submerged, then memory. Fire shaping water, water reshaping fire. Emergence becoming disappearance, then emergence again. In the endless expanse of a drowned planet, these islands are less territory than interruptions, less continents than fleeting prayers. And yet their impermanence speaks more deeply than permanence ever could. For if even in oceans, fire can rise, then what other edges of perception might dissolve in such a world? If islands are only temporary pauses in a sea of continuity, then how far do we trust our sense of boundaries at all? If volcanic islands rise and vanish like brief interruptions, fragile pauses carved from fire and then reclaimed by water, what then becomes of our sense of edges? To live on a world of oceans is to live without boundary. Shorelines, the places where sea and land meet and define each other, would not exist. Instead, the horizon stretches unbroken in every direction, dissolving the fundamental frame through which we usually measure place. To exist here is to exist at the edge of perception itself, surrounded by lines that recede forever, never resolving into walls or limitations. The human mind, shaped by land and boundary, yearns for markers. A mountain peak tells us we have arrived. A river crossing separates one way of life from another. A forest edge marks the transition between light and shade. But in an endless water world, those transitions dissolve. Everywhere looks like everywhere else, the same undivided expanse, broken only by waves constantly rearranging themselves. Perhaps here perception shifts, loosening its grip on certainty. We begin not to think of place as fixed, but as floating, drifting, fluid. Could it be that identity itself changes when every edge is blurred? That in the absence of definition, the self begins to dissolve too, not into nothing, but into something larger, something continuous? Science shows us this disorientation in reality. Sailors once crossed vast oceans where weeks passed without sight of land, horizons circling them endlessly until direction itself seemed like an illusion. Even now, satellites trace wave patterns repeating across entire basins, storms circumnavigating the globe as if the atmosphere has no country. Without land, currents and winds become the only guides, and even they carry no permanence. They shift season to season, generation to generation. What, then, anchors memory when geography refuses to hold still? Perhaps only the stars above can serve as fixed reference, cosmic edges reminding us of position in an otherwise edgeless world. And yet even the horizon is not an edge but an illusion, ever moving as we move, retreating endlessly and never permitting us to reach it. In this sense, a water planet embodies infinity more directly than any desert or cosmos. It reminds us that some boundaries are only imagined, tools for our own sense of scale. In truth, there are no final separations, only continuities folded larger than perception allows. Maybe the ocean teaches us this quietly, that edges are ways of comforting ourselves, but the reality of the world is seamless. But there is a deeper question here. Without edges, can memory have shape? Fossils form in cliffs where stone is exposed, history carved open to be read. But a water world, smoothing and covering everything, protects memory in silence while depriving us of access. The edge that reveals is absent. Perhaps that absence is why horizons feel unsettling here, because the past itself remains hidden, dissolved in continuity, inaccessible to perception. Without fracture, without interruption, stories do not emerge. Still, there is beauty in this absence. To live without edges is to belong to the whole. Place ceases to be defined by where it ends, and instead is felt as participation in an unending continuum. The horizon is not a wall, but an invitation, a reminder that distance cannot be conquered, only shared. In this way, perhaps an edgeless planet is not erasure but expansion, not a loss of definition but a return to the vastness we have always been part of. Maybe we have always lived this way, only telling ourselves otherwise with our mountains, our borders, our shorelines. And as we drift in this thought, carried gently by the seamless horizon, we begin to sense how fragile even our understanding of place is. If perception itself can disintegrate into ocean, if edges can vanish until all is continuous, then what of the civilizations that might live upon such waters? How could they form identity, culture, and connection in a world perpetually afloat? If in a world without edges our sense of place dissolves into continuity, then what of civilization itself? How could humanity, so accustomed to ground beneath its feet, reshape its destiny on seas that never end? Would we build our settlements from vessels lashed together, rafts drifting where currents carried them, fragments of community woven like kelp mats upon the surface? Would we raise coral into platforms, coax reefs to serve not only as sanctuaries for life, but as the foundations of floating cities? Or would we slip into something more fluid, surrendering entirely to drift, becoming nomads of water, always moving and never fixed? Imagine a city afloat, its walls soft with growth, hulls of vessels long forgotten, lashed and rebuilt across generations, drifting upon gyres. Homes would not rest upon foundations of stone but upon memory, each generation rebuilding what storms had taken, each culture tied not to soil but to motion itself. Direction would replace address, current would replace border, and perhaps time itself would be told not by the rising of the sun over fields, but by the turning of currents, the return of whales, the migration of plankton. Civilization, in such a form, would be less about permanence and more about adaptation, less about anchoring and more about surviving within fluidity. Science gives us reason to wonder if such a possibility could endure. Even today, fragments of cultures live close to this dream. Seaborne nomads steering by stars, trading from vessel to vessel, reading the swells of ocean as others read the contours of valleys. A water world would turn this tradition into necessity, our very biology and technology bending toward endurance upon the waves. Advancements might not focus on carving land but on cultivating buoyancy, materials that float across centuries, energy pulled not from rivers or soil but directly from wind, tide, and thermal gradients. Perhaps cities themselves would grow like living beings, evolving structures that expand with reefs, thinning in winter storms but regrowing with calm. Could it be civilization would cease to be architecture at all and become organism? But what of our sense of home? On continents, identity is often tied to place, the line of a mountain, the bend of a river, the soil pressed into our stories. In a drifting world, where would that belonging come from? Maybe it would no longer bind to land, but to motion, to community that moves with you, to memory that is carried instead of rooted. Home might become not where we stay but who we travel alongside. Belonging would not be singular and fixed, but plural, layered, tidal. Perhaps every culture upon the ocean would be braided into others, carried forward not as separate nations but as converging currents of memory, reforming with every crossing. And yet, there is fragility here. A single storm could erase a settlement built over generations. Salt and waves would weather every creation, demanding a constant cycle of renewal. Could civilization accept such a rhythm, that nothing lasts, that every anchor is temporary? Maybe we would have to learn what water already teaches. Permanence is an illusion, survival lies in fluidity. Civilizations might come to celebrate impermanence, weaving rituals not for buildings raised forever, but for storms survived, for gatherings scattered and rejoined, for lives honored in echoes carried by tide. Philosophically, this thought awakens something haunting and tender. Would we even call such existence civilization? Or would it become dream, memory, poetry of drifting? Perhaps cultures would live more in stories than in structures, since everything solid dissolves. A people defined by songs sung across waves, by myths that float, by maps written in currents and stars rather than stone. Not because stone was lost, but because the sea does not allow stone to stay. And maybe, in such a life, individual identity itself would soften. We would dissolve as we do in sleep, our edges blurred by belonging, our difference melted into the endless continuity around us. And if so, if the dream of civilization adrift is possible, then what would be preserved of all this in the great diaries of the ocean? Would our rafts, our vessels, our coral-grown monuments leave marks in sediments and isotopes as fossils do? Or would time erase even our drifting civilizations completely, leaving only a thin whisper of their presence in chemical trails? And so, as we float with these drifting visions of cities lashed together, of home as current, of cultures that know themselves only through migration, the question rises again. If everything we build at the surface eventually scatters, if our memories loosen their ties to place, then who keeps record of what was lived? Perhaps the answer does not lie in us at all, but in the quiet sediment of the sea, where invisible layers still capture each breath, each bloom, each loss. If drifting civilizations leave only fragments, if rafts scatter and stories dissolve into currents, then perhaps the ocean itself keeps record for them. Not in towers or in ruins, but in its quietest process. Sediment falling grain by grain into the abyss. Sediment is the diary of oceans. It is the slow writing of time, a patient layering of memory, pressed silently into the floor of the deep. For even where no cliffs rise, even where no stone stands exposed, the ocean writes its own chapters, archiving without intention, preserving what we would otherwise lose. Every flake of calcium shed from a shell, every drift of volcanic ash that settles through the water, every fragment of dust carried from desert winds, all of it sinks eventually. In this way, the surface continually writes to the depths, each season casting its signature downward. Over centuries, these fragments harden into strata, paper-thin at first, then weighted by the layers above. To look into these sediments is to stare into the memory of the ocean, to read the story of climates, extinctions, and resurgences hidden in chemical ratios and fossil grains smaller than the eye perceives. Science, through drilling cores into the seafloor, has found traces of vanished epochs there. The isotopic fingerprints of ice ages, the black scars of asteroid dust, the silent intervals of mass extinctions when biodiversity collapsed. Could it be that the ocean, despite its restlessness, is the planet's most faithful historian, writing not in stone above but in layers beneath? The paradox is that these layers also embody forgetting. Subduction zones pull ocean floors downward, swallowing sediments into the mantle where they are erased, melted back into molten rock. Most of the diary vanishes this way, recycled into fresh crust, lost to deep time. But here and there pockets survive, preserved for millions of years. What remains is uneven, fragmented, but still enough to remind us of what the Earth has passed through. It is as though the ocean has a selective memory, keeping some things, discarding others not by choice, but by the balance of tectonic motion. Memory, like sediment, is never whole. Philosophically, this offers us a strange comfort. If every culture, every tree, every whale one day returns to the sea, dissolved or broken into fragments, then sediment promises that some trace will endure, even if unread. Maybe permanence was never the goal. Maybe it was enough that each layer contributed, that each season left behind its breath. Memory need not be complete to be real. Think of it. A flake of pollen drifting into the sea, falling unnoticed into the abyss, preserved for millions of years, an unintentional marker of forests long gone. Even something so small participates in time's enduring record. And this record is not silent. Each layer carries voices. Light carbon telling of blooms of life. Heavy oxygen telling of ice gripping the planet. Even dust from deserts, carried across hemispheres, written in thin seams, speaks of winds that cried across continents no longer here. It is astonishing to realize that oceans record even what they erase, holding contradictions at once. Preserving and destroying, remembering and forgetting, creating continuity by allowing discontinuity. Could it be that sediment is not only the ocean's diary, but also its meditation, a logbook written in patient repetition, where the act of writing matters more than the survival of the words? And as we drift in this thought, slow and weightless, we realize how fragile our own traces may be. A drowned ship, a piece of plastic, fragments of coral cities. All of them will sink, break, scatter, and some will join these layers. They too will be written into the record, not because they were intended to be, but because the sea receives everything. Perhaps, in the far future, what survives of us will not be our voices or our stories, but the sediments that contain our chemistry, our dust, our quiet signatures pressed beneath miles of shifting tides. But if the ocean preserves so much, albeit incompletely, then what of the darker truth, the other side of sedimentary archives? If history is written in layers, then extinction is written as silence, as gaps in the rhythm of deposition, as horizons where the story abruptly changes. And so the question emerges. In a water world that records its memory beneath the tide, how many silences might one day mark not only species, but entire epochs? And if sediment is the diary of oceans, recording voices in thin layers of time, then it is also the place where silence appears. For not every page is full. In some layers, there is absence. Whole species vanishing, ecosystems collapsing, voices fading into seams of emptiness. Extinction, in a water world, would not roar or break in sudden shouts. It would arrive like a curtain drawn slowly across a stage, the audience unaware until the actors were gone. Quiet, steady, final. On continents, extinction can feel dramatic. Forests fall, rivers dry, bones bleach beneath sun and dust. But in an endless ocean, the vanishing would be softer, almost invisible. Creatures that cannot swim forever, plants that cannot root in drifting sand, would dissolve quietly into absence. Their trace would remain only as faint chemical ghosts, tiny signatures in isotopes, or shells buried in the sedimentary record. There would be no monuments of loss, no cliffs to display the sharp boundary of their disappearance. Only the mute stillness of a layer too faint for the eye to notice, until we look deeper and realize what is missing. Science tells us that 5 great mass extinctions mark Earth's past, each written in fossils and isotopes, each leaving gaps in continuity. Trilobites erased, ammonites gone, forests suffocated by carbon and fire, the ocean itself turned anoxic, black waters stretching across centuries. Could it be, in a water planet without land, extinction would be even harder to perceive? Not because it would not happen, but because the cycles of life and death here are so fluid, so easily absorbed into new forms, that vanishing might look too much like continuation. Maybe species would fade like echoes, each one softer than the last, until only silence remained where once there had been song. And yet, silence is never truly silent. Gaps in food webs ripple outward, one absence creating another. A fish no longer hunted grows too many, consuming beyond balance. Predator gone leaves others unmoored. A shifting current carries nutrients elsewhere, and the reef, once alive, bleaches into shadow. In this way, extinction becomes less an ending than a slow unraveling, the invisible thinning of threads in a web stretched too wide. Eventually, the whole fabric changes its shape, subtle but undeniable, like a piece of music with notes that never return. Could it be that life itself feels the weight of memory, even when we cannot? Philosophically, the slow curtain of extinction forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Do we only recognize existence in its presence, or can we hear the weight of absence as well? The ocean, in its patience, carries both. It recycles what is gone. It folds extinction into nutrient, loss into growth. Not because it is merciful, but because that is its way. And still, for all its cycles, something vital is always missing. Sediment testifies not only to survival, but to all that can never return. Perhaps then it is memory, again, that makes extinction haunting. Not because all things must end, but because endings mean that some chapters can never be reread. Life can reemerge, but it will not be the same life. New songs will rise, but the old ones vanish. Maybe memory aches more in water because the sea absorbs voices so gently, until it feels as if nothing was ever there. And yet we know from patterns, from science, from intuition, that everything once was. And so extinction moves across the water world like a shadow, not sudden, but gradual, eroding presence until only silence is left. A slow curtain drawn without sound. But in imagining that silence, we cannot help but wonder. If life can vanish so quietly, without leaving fossils or monuments, then are there other water worlds across the stars where extinction has already passed, where silence itself is the only survivor? If life here can slip so quietly into extinction, if silence can outlast song, then we begin to wonder, what other oceans exist beyond our own, and what stories do they hold? For Earth is not alone in its waters. Across the galaxy, astronomers have found hints of planets where seas may stretch endlessly, where worlds may be nothing but liquid horizons. To imagine them is to imagine mirrors of ourselves, other water worlds, other diaries of time, inviting us to reflect back upon our own ocean and wonder what it might yet become, or what it once was. Science has already shown us possibilities. Exoplanets discovered far beyond our solar system bear signatures of water vapor, atmospheres dense with the breath of oceans. Some orbit small stars closely enough that their surfaces may be liquid seas, heated gently, forever blue. Others hide under ice, oceans concealed, where kilometers of frozen shell shield liquid water from space. Even moons within our own planetary neighborhood may hold oceans below their crusts. Europa with its cracked ice, Enceladus with plumes that whisper of salt water across the dark. Could it be that water is not rare at all, but common? That the cosmos is seeded with drowned worlds, each whispering their own stories beneath tides we will never hear? On such planets, geology itself changes. No continents rise as anchors. No mountains break the continuity of the horizon. Instead, the entire climate, the entire memory of the planet belongs to liquid and vapor. Currents would become continents. Storms would become nations. Time would be held not in cliffs but in tides. And without land, life, if it exists, would evolve in shapes unlike any we know, bound only to drift, to swim, to float. Perhaps some would be luminous, weaving patterns of collective light, communication in radiance instead of voice. Perhaps others would anchor themselves to volcanic chimneys rising from fracture zones, nourished by chemistry alone, their lives older than surface worlds. Or perhaps nothing moves at all. Only oceans waiting, empty and silent, promising but unrealized. Philosophically, these imagined worlds stare back at us. If oceans are common, does that mean life, too, is common? Or is Earth's story a fragile rarity? Are oceans holding not only water but the delicate shards of improbable chance? Maybe the ocean as cradle is no guarantee. It may hold potential without outcome, memory without voice, a diary unwritten. The thought unsettles. It suggests water can be silence as much as song, possibility as much as realization. And still we wonder, how would memory work on such planets? Without continents to preserve fossils, without mountains to expose strata, would all trace be locked beneath sediments, erased by subduction, recycled into mantle heat? Would creatures there leave any record at all? Or would even their greatest civilizations dissolve in the endless blue, erased the moment the currents carried them away? Perhaps the ocean alone remembers them, the same way ours remembers forests drowned or species vanished, keeping not their detail but their chemistry. Maybe, across space, oceans archive their inhabitants in patterns of isotopes, pressures, and currents. Quiet notes written in water, notes no one will ever read. The wonder of this thought is its mirror. Each discovery of a distant ocean is also a discovery of ourselves. Each water-rich exoplanet reflects the question back to Earth. Has our planet already lived this way? Was there a point in deep time when continents nearly vanished beneath seas, when forests drowned and coral built the only architecture? Or is that a future still to come, when glaciers melt, when seas reclaim, when Earth resembles those imagined sisters across the stars? Could it be that time moves in circles bigger than we perceive, where Earth is one of countless planets shifting between the grip of land and the dominion of water? And beyond science, there is awe. To gaze at exoplanet data, faint signals of molecules carried hundreds of light years to our instruments, is to listen for whispers through vast silence. Maybe these whispers belong to oceans foaming in alien storms. Maybe they belong to ice worlds deeper than our own. Or maybe they are empty, only illusions of familiarity, reminding us that the cosmos is always greater than the reach of our understanding. And yet, in imagining them, we cannot help but return inward. If water worlds exist elsewhere, scattered across the galaxy, then our oceans are not only ours. They are part of something larger, part of a tapestry of liquid possibility, written across planets beyond counting. And just as we dream of them, perhaps their vast horizons mirror back, reflecting Earth as one small water world, one story among many. And with this thought, another rises quietly. If oceans stretch across stars, each holding possibility of life or silence, then how much weight do we give to the silence of our own? If memory is held in reflections beyond Earth, what becomes of the silence already gathering within our seas? And if other oceans stretch across distant planets, their voices faint and unreachable, then our gaze inevitably returns to the silence of our own. For even here, on Earth's seas, silence is not the absence of sound. It is distance, stretched across horizons so vast that voices grow faint, dissolve, and vanish. On a planet covered in water, where nothing interrupts the line between one drift and another, silence becomes not a pause but a space, a measure of separation written into every current. Imagine listening across such an ocean. A whale begins its song, low and resonant, carrying for hundreds of miles. The notes bend and refract along thermocline layers, traveling farther still. Yet even those voices fade in time, stretch thin by distance until they dissolve into background currents. Silence arrives not because nothing was spoken, but because what was spoken traveled beyond our reach. Perhaps this is the truest silence a water world offers, the sound that continues long after we can no longer hear it. Science shows us again how sound behaves differently in oceans than on land. In vast expanses of water, low frequencies carry extraordinary distances, whispering across basins. But there are also shadows, regions where sound cannot travel, where thermoclines bend and scatter it into fragments. These acoustic shadows, invisible to the eye, create patches of isolation in an ocean that seems continuous. Could it be that in a water world, silence is not mere emptiness, but intricately shaped by the very physics of liquid? An absence sculpted, nuanced, textured like stone, except softer? But silence is more than physics. It is perception. On land we fill absences with echoes, with reflections from cliffs or trees. At sea there are no reflections to return to us. A cry, a call, a pulse moves outward, but does not return. The horizon absorbs it. Distance dilutes it. What remains is a feeling of vastness too wide to measure, a quiet that seems to press upon the chest, not because nothing exists, but because too much exists beyond hearing. Silence here is not a gap. It is presence spread too far for perception to gather. Philosophically, this changes our relationship to memory. In silence, absence feels final. But in distance, absence is simply unreachable. A song still exists, but beyond the limits of our ears. Perhaps loss in such a world is always partial, the knowledge that what we love is not destroyed, only carried too far to touch. Could it be that our greatest griefs are not endings, but distances? Our most haunting silences, not voids, but voices beyond reach? And this silence is long. It stretches not only across waves but across time. Civilizations at sea may leave traces carried by current, stories spoken into wind, songs etched in coral reefs. And yet, most would fade into horizons too wide, memory spreading until it dissolves into uniformity. Silence, in this sense, is not the death of sound but its eternal spreading, a thread pulled so thin across centuries that it cannot be held anymore. Maybe that is why the ocean feels so heavy, as if it carries not only the weight of water, but the weight of every sound, every story, stretched, dissolved, and displaced. And still, silence is not only burden. It is also rest. For in absence of boundaries, in absence of returning echoes, the mind is allowed to drift without interruption. Silence across an ocean is not oppressive. It is vast gentleness, an invitation to loosen our edges and merge into the horizon. Perhaps this is what a water world would teach above all. That silence is not something to fear, but a shape of time itself. And yet, if silence can stretch like this, spread across centuries, carrying what once was into distances too wide to recover, then what happens when memory itself drifts with that same rhythm? If silence holds voices beyond reach, could memory too be washed into tides? Never gone, never destroyed, but always receding just beyond our perception? And if silence can stretch across centuries, carrying voices beyond the reach of hearing, then perhaps memory moves in the same way. Not as something safely held, but as something carried by tide, endlessly shifting, dissolving, reforming, always just beyond full retrieval. On a water world, time itself becomes fluid. It does not move like a river confined within banks or a line carved through mountains. It sways instead like a tide, advancing and retreating, each crest leaving behind only a trace before vanishing back into the whole. Imagine trying to remember in a world without landmarks. No cliffs etched with eras, no valleys preserving stories in stone, no forests burned into rings of wood, only waves, endless, moving, repeating. Perhaps our identities themselves would begin to loosen in such a place, recorded not in permanence but in cycles. You and I would not be remembered as fixed portraits but as rhythms, moments echoing forward. Just as each wave is unique yet still part of the same sea, our stories might drift this way too. Never identical, never lost, always reforming in echoes that overlap and fade. Science offers us another layer to this thought. Isotopes preserved in shells, layers pressed into sediment, hold imprints of climates, of shifts in chemistry, of tides long vanished. These records remind us that time can be found in repetition, in cycles of warming and cooling, in migrations and extinctions, in the endless patterns of water weaving itself across centuries. Could it be that memory itself is not linear but tidal, written not as line but as rhythm, waves reverberating through history long after the original event has passed? Philosophically, this thought holds a profound uncertainty. If memory behaves like tide, then perhaps we never hold anything completely. We reach for the wave as it comes to shore, but already it is retreating, carrying fragments away. We gather what we can, but much slips through. And yet, perhaps this is not failure but balance. If everything could be remembered exactly, nothing could move forward. It is forgetting that makes room for renewal. It is loss that allows the tide to return. Maybe meaning does not reside in what stays, but in the rhythm of return itself. In such a world, identity might feel dreamlike. We might measure ourselves by cycles of recurrence, returning patterns of stars, seasons of current, migrations of life, knowing we are not static but always in motion, our edges blurred into the larger continuity. Could it be that this is closer to truth than the solidity we claim on land? That we are, and always have been, more wave than stone, more rhythm than permanence? Memory, in this sense, is not about fixing the past, but about carrying its motion forward into what comes next. And yet, there is ache in this recognition. To know that our stories scatter across water is to know we cannot hold them all. The tide carries pieces into distance, spreading them thin, dispersing them until they vanish past perception. What moments of history, what voices, what civilizations might already rest beneath these tides, unretrievable? Maybe somewhere beneath the ocean, the memory of a vanished people lies dissolved, not erased, but distributed, every drop of water carrying only a fragment too small to recognize. Maybe our own memory someday will scatter the same way, diffused across the sea until only elements remain. And still, there is beauty in this drifting. For if memory is tide, then it is also connection. Each story touches another as it spreads. Each life blurs into countless others as it dissolves. Our identities, scattered, are not lost. They are shared, retold in forms we could not control, carried wider than we could ever imagine. Perhaps in this there is a gentleness, a promise that though no story remains whole, no story is ever fully gone. And so memory meets the tide in the same way sound meets distance, fading and returning, scattering and reforming. To live in a water world is to accept this rhythm, to breathe with it, to dissolve into it. And as we drift with that thought, one lingering question remains. If memory blurs so easily with tide, then what of the bedrock beneath, hidden deep below the sea? Does it too remember, or is even the foundation of stone destined to be rewritten? If memory scatters with tide, if stories dissolve into cycles of waves, then perhaps we turn our gaze downward, searching for something firmer, something beneath the drift. For even in a world of endless water, the stone remains. Hidden under miles of ocean, unseen but eternal, lies the bedrock of the planet. It does not vanish with tide or storm. It does not scatter with silence. It waits, vast and immovable, carrying within it the slow pulse of tectonics, a heartbeat measured not in years, but in millions of years, steady beneath the liquid veil. Imagine sinking downward through all those layers of water, through light and through shadow, deeper and deeper until you reach the seafloor. Here lies the great foundation of basalt and granite, broken and scarred by rifts, reshaped again and again by the spreading and sinking of tectonic plates. This is the true bed beneath the world, the anchor that the ocean cannot dissolve. Here, continents of stone exist, not above the water, not visible, but hidden as quiet architecture beneath the abyss. Each fracture, each rise, each trench is part of Earth's long conversation with itself, a story told in the language of pressure and molten heat. Science teaches us that the ocean floor is always moving. Some rocks here are younger than memory, formed yesterday where magma spilled from the mid-ocean ridges. Others are ancient, pushed slowly toward subduction zones where they will one day sink back into the mantle. The crust beneath the sea is born, moves, and dies in cycles slower than any human can perceive. Perhaps in this lies the truest kind of patience. Stone, reshaped without hurry, folded into patterns of creation and destruction so gradual that to us they might appear eternal. Could it be that the permanence we search for is not found in objects at the surface, but in processes below, vast cycles that outlast identity and even memory itself? And yet, this permanence is relative. Bedrock feels eternal compared to waves or currents, but deep time assures us that even stone bends to entropy. Mountains rise from ridges, only to be ground down. Trenches widen into chasms before collapsing. Sediments harden into rock, then are swallowed back into mantle fire. Nothing lasts untouched, not even what lies beneath oceans. Still, in the rhythm of this impermanence, there is an order so vast and reassuring it feels like eternity to us. The stone endures, not because it resists change, but because it is change, slow enough to become indistinguishable from permanence in our narrow view of time. Perhaps that is what makes the seafloor both geology and philosophy. It is the place where time becomes stone, where chemistry becomes shape, where every ocean above is held upon a foundation of processes invisible from the surface. Does the stone remember what lies above it? Maybe in its minerals, in isotope trails, in the shifted alignment of crystals under heat and pressure, there is memory written without witness. The rocks carry remnants of ancient oceans, fragments of seas long gone dissolved within them. Each plate, each basalt flow carries a trace of vanished worlds. Stone, in its silence, holds echoes larger than any sediment grain or coral reef could preserve. And still, bedrock hums beneath all of this, pulsing faintly in geothermal heat, in tremors where plates meet, in mountains raised under blackness. There is a rhythm here deeper than waves, a vibration steady enough to anchor perception, reassuring enough to remind us that beneath motion, beneath tide and silence, something larger endures, not unchanged, but unceasing. And if identity in a water world dissolves into drift and echo, then maybe bedrock is its hidden root, ground we never touch, but on which everything rests. But even this thought opens another that unsettles gently. For if the foundation of stone itself is so impermanent in deep time, constantly recycled, constantly melting into mantle and reborn, then perhaps there is no ultimate permanence at all. Maybe even bedrock is only a pause, a temporary form in Earth's restless cycles. Permanence, then, is illusion, just another tide stretched across timescales too vast for us to see. And yet, to imagine this is not despair, but wonder. For it means that we are never still. Oceans above us, stone below us, silence and drift, decay and renewal, all entwined into one endless longer story. And so we drift into one final question. If even rock is temporary, if even the deepest foundation bends itself back into cycles, then what would it mean for a world of endless water to never remember land at all? And if even bedrock bends back into mantle, if permanence itself is only an illusion spread across vast cycles, then the question surfaces, quiet but immense. What if land never returned? What if water, once risen, never gave us back our continents, never revealed the shapes of valleys or the edges of coasts again? Would the earth, wrapped entirely in ocean, still know itself? Or would it drift into a silence so complete that its memory became nothing but tides, carried endlessly without anchor, its whole identity rewritten as one unbroken sea? Imagine such a planet. No mountains climbing into clouds, no deserts whispering with wind, no forests breathing in light. The horizon would unfurl without difference, a seamless loop of blue circling in every direction. Day after day, year after year, centuries folding into millennia, the same unbroken water stretching outward, indifferent and eternal. At first glance it seems empty, stripped of variation. But imagine lingering with it long enough, and you begin to notice how the ocean itself becomes landscape. Gyres replace mountains. Storm belts replace borders. Currents carve their own invisible valleys, their loops as distinct and enduring as any range of stone. And beneath, ridges, trenches, and volcanic arcs form worlds hidden from our eyes, alien yet still part of this continuous body. Science reminds us that Earth has tilted toward such states before. In ancient epochs, sea levels rose higher than we could dream, continents shrinking to scattered archipelagos, coastlines vanishing beneath vast inland seas. The potential has always been there, and exoplanet research suggests this is not rare. Evidence points to countless ocean worlds scattered across the galaxy, where water dominates, land absent or buried. Could it be that our familiar landscapes are the exception, not the rule? That most planets live this way, carrying their memory only in oceans and echoes? On such a world, extinction would move quietly. Species that require soil, that need roots, that breathe with forests would vanish. What endures would be the fluid and the drifting, creatures born entirely to water. Plankton, whales, jellyfish, beings we cannot yet imagine, sculpted by liquid eternity. Maybe life would simplify, or maybe, in ways we cannot predict, it would flourish in forms more resilient, more strange, more luminous than anything bound once to land. Perhaps complexity would not lessen but transform, evolving into societies of light, of song, of current. But they too would dissolve in time, as all things do, into the silence of sediment and isotopes, preserved only as chemistry hidden below. Would Earth still feel itself alive if its memory was only fluid, never stone? Philosophically, the thought unsettles. Humanity has tied its meaning so closely to land. Cities built upon ridges, temples carved into cliffs, stories bound to mountains and rivers. Without these, without land at all, perhaps memory would have to drift into something less fixed. Culture would become waterborne, stories carried not by monuments but by repetition, song, migration. Identity itself would dissolve into motion. Could we learn to be such a people, a species without land? Could the earth itself learn to be such a planet, consciousness carried only by tides? Maybe the answer is already within us, for we come from the ocean, shaped by its chemistry, our first ancestors emerging from its rhythms. Perhaps returning fully to water would not erase us. It would remind us of origins we spent so long forgetting. Still, there is a gentleness, too, in imagining such a fate. An ocean world is not silent, even if it erases the edges we cling to. Its silence is not emptiness, but distance, voices carried further than we can hear, songs stretched too thin to retrieve but always moving. Its memory is not erased but scattered, diffused like salt across the whole sea. Perhaps this is what Earth would become, a recorder not of form, but of flow, a world whose identity is continuity itself. And yet, one more question rises, soft as breath. If land never returned, if oceans reclaimed everything and held it forever, would anyone, anywhere, remember what once emerged above the waves? Or would our continents become myth, forgotten as fully as drowned forests, their memory existing only in thin seams of fossil islands far beneath abyssal plains? Maybe land itself would dissolve into story, a dream once imagined by water but never repeated. Maybe the earth would forget land as fully as we forget our own earliest memories. Still part of us, but unreachable, unknowable, absorbed into silence. And so the thought rests with us, haunting, delicate, unfinished. An earth forever drowned. A planet whose memory is only oceans, only tides, only echoes across silence. But if this much can be surrendered, then we are left to wonder. What else, hidden even deeper, have we already forgotten?